Operation Barbarossa was the code name for Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II, launched on June 22, 1941. It stands as one of the largest military campaigns in history, involving over 3 million Axis troops, thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. Barbarossa was drawn from the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, nicknamed Barbarossa, or Redbeard, symbolizing Germanic strength, unity, and conquest. Hitler chose this name deliberately, intending the campaign to be a swift and overwhelming victory, securing vital Lebensraum, living space, for Germany in the East, and destroying what he viewed as the ideological and racial enemy, the Soviet Union. Hitler's plans for Barbarossa were deeply intertwined with Nazi ideology. He saw the Soviet Union as the homeland of Judeo-Bolshevism, a dangerous, corrupting force that combined communism with supposed Jewish influence. To Hitler, defeating the Soviet Union was not merely a military objective, but a crusade to exterminate communism and establish German dominance over the East. The invasion was designed as a war of annihilation, involving not only the destruction of the Soviet military, but also the subjugation or elimination of large portions of its civilian population. The operation's strategic objectives were clear yet incredibly ambitious. The German High Command planned a rapid advance using blitzkrieg, lightning war, tactics, fast-moving armored units, close air support, and motorized infantry, aimed at encircling and destroying Soviet forces before they could fully mobilize. The ultimate goals included capturing Moscow, the political heart of the Soviet Union, Leningrad, an industrial hub and symbolic city, and the resource-rich agricultural regions of Ukraine. Success in these objectives would cripple the Soviet war machine and provide Germany with the raw materials essential for sustaining its war effort. Despite the careful planning, Operation Barbarossa carried enormous risks. The sheer size of the Soviet Union, its vast and varied terrain, and its enormous population presented logistical and operational challenges unlike anything the Wehrmacht had faced in Western Europe. The Soviet military was much larger than Germany initially believed, and while it had been weakened by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s, it retained considerable depth and resilience. Furthermore, the brutal Russian winter was a formidable natural enemy that German planners underestimated. The invasion began after 2 years of a tenuous non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, between Germany and the Soviet Union. Hitler had agreed to this pact temporarily to avoid a two-front war while he conquered Western Europe. However, the Luftwaffe launched devastating air raids on Soviet airfields, communication centers, and infrastructure, aiming to cripple the Red Army's ability to respond effectively. Early in the campaign, German forces achieved stunning successes. They encircled and captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in massive pockets at Bialystok and Minsk, destroying large portions of the Red Army before they could regroup. However, the initial rapid advances masked deeper problems. The enormous distances over which the Wehrmacht operated began to stretch supply lines dangerously thin. The Soviets, despite initial losses, began mobilizing millions more soldiers and moving key industries eastward beyond the reach of German bombers. The sheer scale of the Soviet Union meant the war would be longer and bloodier than Hitler had anticipated. Operation Barbarossa quickly escalated into a brutal war of attrition. Alongside military battles, it unleashed horrific atrocities against civilians. Einsatzgruppen death squads followed the army, executing tens of thousands of Jews, communists, and other undesirables in mass shootings. The invasion also led to the starvation, displacement, and suffering of millions of Soviet civilians. In retrospect, Operation Barbarossa was both a military gamble and an ideological crusade. It embodied Hitler's vision of German domination of Europe and the ruthless elimination of his enemies. Yet it also exposed fatal flaws, overconfidence, underestimation of the Soviet capacity for resistance, logistical overreach, and brutal weather that would ultimately contribute to the operation's failure. The invasion opened the Eastern Front, the largest and bloodiest theater of World War II, consuming more resources and lives than any other campaign. The war in the East would determine the fate of the Third Reich and shape the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. When did Operation Barbarossa begin? Operation Barbarossa officially began This marked a decisive turning point in World War II, shattering the fragile peace established just 2 years earlier by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in August 1939. The date of June 22nd was not chosen arbitrarily. It was the culmination of months of secret planning and preparations, reflecting careful strategic timing by Adolf Hitler and his military commanders. The operation was designed to begin once the spring thaw had passed, ensuring that the notorious Russian mud seasons, known as Rasputitsa, which rendered roads impassable, had ended. German planners wanted to avoid the mud that could bog down tanks and supply vehicles, which had severely hampered military operations in previous conflicts on the Eastern Front. June also offered the advantage of long daylight hours, enabling the German Luftwaffe, or Air Force, to carry out sustained bombing raids and reconnaissance missions. The early morning start was intended to catch the Soviet defenses off guard, striking before most troops could fully prepare for an attack of such unprecedented scale. For years before the launch, Hitler had been obsessed with the idea of conquering the Soviet Union. His ideological hatred for communism and the belief that, with Britain still defiant and the United States edging closer to war, Hitler decided that eliminating the Soviet threat was essential for Germany's long-term survival and dominance. The secrecy surrounding the invasion was intense. Despite intelligence warnings from British and Soviet spies, as well as aerial reconnaissance revealing German troop movements, Stalin remained skeptical. He distrusted Western intelligence sources and believed that Hitler would not dare break the non-aggression pact while Germany was still engaged in the West. This disbelief contributed to the Soviet Union's unpreparedness for the onslaught. In the days leading up to June 22nd, Germany amassed over 3 million soldiers along a front stretching more than 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This included more than 600,000 motor vehicles, nearly 4,000 tanks, and over 2,700 aircraft, making it the largest invasion force ever assembled at the time. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering, and the complexity of coordinating simultaneous attacks across such an expansive front was unprecedented. On the morning of June 22nd, the attack began with a massive aerial bombardment. The Luftwaffe unleashed waves of bombers targeting Soviet airfields, communication centers, railways, and cities near the front. The goal was to destroy the Red Air Force on the ground and disrupt Soviet command and control systems. The initial air attacks were devastating, catching many Soviet air units unprepared and destroying large portions of their aircraft before they could take off. Simultaneously, millions of German troops crossed the Soviet border at multiple points along the front. Blitzkrieg tactics, perfected in earlier campaigns in Poland and Western Europe, were employed with ferocity. Armored divisions and mechanized infantry spearheaded rapid advances, encircling Soviet units and cutting them off from reinforcements and supplies. In the first weeks, the German army made remarkable progress. They achieved several massive encirclements, including the battles around Bialystok and Minsk, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. These early victories reinforced Hitler's belief in the operation's success and the expectation that the Soviet Union could be defeated within months. However, beneath these initial triumphs lay warning signs of deeper challenges. The German army's rapid advance stretched supply lines dangerously thin, making it difficult to deliver fuel, ammunition, and food to the front. The Soviet forces, though initially overwhelmed, were far from defeated. Stalin ordered a total mobilization of the country's military and industrial resources. Factories were evacuated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers, and millions of new soldiers were drafted to replenish the ranks. The timing of the invasion also meant that the Wehrmacht would soon face the full force of the Russian climate. Although the start was carefully planned to avoid the worst of the mud seasons and winter, the campaign was expected to last long enough to bring German troops deep into Soviet territory. This meant German soldiers would have to endure harsh weather and vast, unfamiliar terrain, factors that would prove catastrophic in the months to come. June 22, 1941, thus marked the beginning of the largest and bloodiest front in history. The decision to invade the Soviet Union shattered any remaining hopes for peace between Germany and the USSR, turning the war into a brutal, ideological conflict characterized by unimaginable suffering and destruction. Operation Barbarossa's start date symbolized more than just a military assault. It was the opening of a vast, brutal chapter in World War II, where entire armies, cities, and populations would be engulfed in the horrors of total war. Which countries were involved in Operation Barbarossa? Operation Barbarossa was not just a German campaign against the Soviet Union, it involved multiple countries, either as Axis collaborators or as targets caught in the maelstrom of one of history's most colossal military conflicts. The invasion reflected both the ambitions of Nazi Germany and the geopolitical complexities of early World War II, where alliances, occupations, and collaborations shaped the unfolding tragedy. At the heart of Operation Barbarossa stood Nazi Germany, the architect and driving force of the invasion. Under Adolf Hitler's leadership, Germany sought to conquer the vast territories of the Soviet Union, seizing control of its immense natural resources, industrial capacity, and strategic position. The Wehrmacht, Germany's unified armed forces, marshaled its armies, air force, and mechanized units into one of the largest invasion forces ever assembled. However, Germany did not act alone. Several Axis allies contributed troops, resources, and strategic support to the operation, though the scale of their involvement varied. The main countries allied with Germany in Barbarossa included 1. Romania. Romania played a critical role in Operation Barbarossa, contributing the largest foreign contingent of troops among the Axis allies. In Bukovina in 1940, territories Romania sought to reclaim. Romanian forces participated heavily on the southern flank of the invasion, particularly in the drive toward Ukraine and Crimea. Romanian armies engaged in major battles, including the siege of Odessa and the assault on Sevastopol. While their equipment and training were generally inferior to German forces, Romanian troops were vital in stretching Soviet defenses and holding ground. 2. Finland. Though Finland was never officially part of the Axis alliance, it fought alongside Germany during Operation Barbarossa in what is known as the continuation of the front near Karelia and the Arctic. Finnish troops advanced to recapture territory lost during the Winter War and even pushed into Soviet lands beyond the pre-war borders. However, Finland's participation was primarily defensive and aimed at territorial restoration rather than ideological alignment with Nazi goals. 3. Hungary. Hungary, under the leadership of Miklos Horthy, was another Axis ally, contributing forces to the Eastern Campaign. Although its participation was smaller compared to Romania, Hungarian troops fought alongside German forces on the Eastern Front, engaging in battles across Ukraine and Southern Italy's contribution to Operation Barbarossa was relatively limited, but it still committed an expeditionary force known as the Italian Army in Russia, Armir. Italy's involvement was driven by Mussolini's desire to support Hitler's war efforts and to assert Italian power in Europe. Italian forces participated in combat operations primarily on the southern sector of the front, supporting German advances through Ukraine. However, Italian troops were often ill-equipped for the harsh conditions and faced severe losses during the Soviet counteroffensives. 5. Slovakia. Slovakia, a German puppet state established after the dissolution of the Union, the vast multinational communist state led by Joseph Stalin. The USSR was the primary target of the German invasion, and its massive territory, population, and military resources made it the central theater of World War II's Eastern Front. On the other side of Operation Barbarossa was the Soviet Union, the vast multinational communist state led by Joseph Stalin. The USSR was the primary target of the German invasion, and its massive territory, population, and military resources made it the central theater of World War II's Eastern Front. The Soviet Union was a union of multiple republics, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and parts of Central Asia. This diversity shaped both the strengths and challenges of the Soviet war effort. The Red Army, the Soviet military force, was one of the largest in the world, numbering in the millions by 1941. Despite the catastrophic surprise of the German invasion, the Soviet Union mobilized its population and industry with extraordinary determination. Factories were relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach, and the government implemented a ruthless system of conscription and production to sustain the war effort. Millions of Soviet soldiers, many poorly trained and equipped at first, were thrown into the fight to defend their homeland. Other countries and puppet states, while the main Axis countries listed above contributed troops directly, other territories and puppet regimes were involved in varying capacities. The fascist Ustaše regime provided volunteers who fought on the Eastern Front alongside German units. Spain sent the Blue Division, a volunteer force of anti-communist Spaniards, to support German operations in the Soviet Union. Although Spain remained officially neutral, these volunteers fought primarily around Leningrad. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, saw many of their populations forcibly conscripted or volunteering to fight against Soviet forces, often under German command. Some Soviet citizens, disillusioned by Stalin's regime or motivated by nationalist sentiments, also collaborated with the Germans, forming auxiliary police, or instead, they viewed the German invasion as an opportunity to strengthen the Soviet Union as a key partner against Nazi Germany. Britain, having endured the Blitz and standing alone against the Axis, sent diplomatic support and limited material aid to the Soviets through the Arctic convoys, transporting weapons, vehicles, and supplies. The United States, though not yet officially at war, Pearl Harbor would occur 6 months later, Soviet Union, but involved a complex web of alliances and interests that would eventually reshape the entire world. Operation Barbarossa was fundamentally a German-led invasion, but it was not fought by Germany alone. Several Axis powers, Romania, Finland, Hungary, Italy, and Slovakia, contributed forces, motivated by territorial ambitions, ideological affinities, or political necessity. The Soviet Union, a vast and diverse nation, was the resilient and determined defender, mobilizing its enormous resources in the face of an existential threat. The involvement of these countries and factions reveals the wider complexity of the Eastern Front. It was a clash not only between two ideologies, but between multinational coalitions with differing goals, capabilities, and stakes in the brutal war that engulfed Europe and beyond. What were the main objectives of Operation Barbarossa? Operation Barbarossa was conceived by Adolf Hitler and the German High Command as a decisive military campaign aimed at fundamentally altering the balance of power in Europe and beyond. Its objectives extended far beyond mere territorial conquest. They were deeply intertwined with Nazi ideological ambitions, economic imperatives, and strategic military goals. Understanding these objectives reveals not only the military rationale, but also the brutal vision Hitler had for the future of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Strategic military objectives. At the core of Barbarossa lay a plan for a rapid and overwhelming victory against the Soviet Union. The German military intended to crush the Red Army in a series of lightning strikes, employing the blitzkrieg tactics that had proven so effective in Western Europe. The strategic objectives were focused primarily on three major geographic and political targets. Capture of Moscow. As the Soviet capital, Moscow was the political, administrative, and communications center of the USSR. Capturing Moscow was seen as critical to paralyzing Soviet command and control, disrupting the government, and delivering a psychological blow that might collapse Soviet resistance. The German High Command anticipated that taking Moscow would be a decisive step toward total victory. Seizure of Leningrad. Located in the northwest near the Baltic Sea, Leningrad was a major industrial center and symbolic city with historical importance as the former capital of Imperial Russia. Its capture would deny the Soviets an important port and industrial hub, further weakening their war production capacity. Control of Ukraine and its resources. The rich agricultural and industrial lands of Ukraine were crucial. The fertile plains were ideal for food production, vital for sustaining Germany's military and civilian population. Ukraine also possessed significant coal and iron deposits, essential raw materials for armaments. By securing Ukraine, Germany aimed to cripple Soviet resource capacity while feeding its own war machine. Together, these objectives outlined a plan to strike at the Soviet Union's heartlands, cutting off its ability to continue fighting and forcing a swift Soviet collapse. Economic and ideological goals, Lebensraum and racial policy. Beyond these strategic military aims, Operation Barbarossa was fundamentally driven by Nazi ideology. Central to Hitler's vision was the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. This was the belief that the German people required vast territories to the east to sustain their population and empire. Hitler envisioned a racially restructured Europe, where Slavic peoples would be subjugated, displaced, or exterminated, making way for German settlers. The invasion of the Soviet Union was thus not just a military campaign, but a colonial conquest. The Nazis planned to seize the Soviet territories, depopulate them of their existing inhabitants, particularly Jews, communists, and Slavs, and repopulate them with Germans. This genocidal vision was outlined in the infamous Generalplan Ost, a secret plan for the ethnic cleansing and colonization of Eastern Europe. Economic exploitation was central to these objectives. The rich farmland and natural resources of the Soviet Union were to fuel the German war effort and economy. The seizure of oil fields in the Caucasus, mineral mines, and agricultural land was aimed at making Germany self-sufficient and independent from hostile nations' supplies. Military defeat of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa also sought the complete military defeat of the Soviet Union. The German High Command believed that by destroying the Soviet Red Army and capturing key cities and industrial centers, the Soviet state would collapse politically and militarily. The Germans planned to encircle and annihilate Soviet forces in massive pincer movements. The campaign was divided into three major army groups. Army Group North, tasked with advancing through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, driving toward Moscow. Army Group South, moving into Ukraine and the resource-rich southern territories. This three-pronged attack was intended to fragment the Soviet defense and prevent coordinated counterattacks. Hitler was also motivated by a desire to neutralize the Soviet Union as a military and ideological threat to Germany's domination of Europe. Since the 1930s, the USSR had been building its military strength, modernizing its armed forces, and promoting communist ideology abroad. For the Nazis, communism was the arch-enemy, both ideologically and geopolitically. By destroying the Soviet Union, Germany would eliminate a powerful adversary and open the path for further expansion into Asia and the Middle East. Hitler even dreamed of eventual German control stretching to the Indian Ocean and beyond. Long-term strategic considerations. Beyond the immediate military and ideological aims, Barbarossa was also designed with long-term strategic considerations in mind. Control of Soviet territory would prevent a future Soviet resurgence and create a buffer zone protecting Germany from attacks from the east. Moreover, the operation was meant to support Germany's broader war effort by securing resources and freeing up troops previously tied down on the Eastern Front for deployment elsewhere, such as against Britain or later the United States. Despite these ambitious goals, German planners made critical miscalculations about what it would take to achieve them. They underestimated the size, resilience, and capacity of the Soviet Union to mobilize resources and manpower. The belief that the Soviet state would collapse rapidly after losing key cities proved false. Additionally, Hitler's racial ideology led to strategic errors. The focus on extermination and brutal occupation policies alienated many Soviet citizens who might otherwise have been passive or even supportive. This fueled widespread partisan resistance and prolonged the conflict. The finance of Division, the main objectives of Operation Barbarossa, were multifaceted and intertwined. They combined to face rapid military conquests of Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine. Dynasty, economic exploitation to secure vital resources and sustain Germany's war effort. Dynasty, ideological goals centered on Lebensraum, racial cleansing, and the destruction of communism. Dynasty, strategic defeat and neutralization of the Soviet Union as a military and geopolitical rival. These ambitious goals drove the planning and execution of Barbarossa, but also sowed the seeds for its eventual failure. The clash between Nazi hubris and Soviet resilience would define the brutal and bloody Eastern Front for the remainder of World War II. How did the geographical features of the Soviet Union affect Operation Barbarossa? Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history, unfolded across an immense and varied landscape that stretched thousands of miles from the frozen forests of the Baltic in the north to the steppes of Ukraine and the Caucasus Mountains in the south. The vast geographical features of the Soviet Union played a decisive role in shaping the course, challenges, and ultimate outcomes of the campaign. The immensity of Soviet territory. One of the most daunting geographical factors was sheer size. The Soviet Union was the largest country in the world, spanning approximately 22.4 million square kilometers, 8.6 million square miles. The front line of Barbarossa extended over 1,800 miles, from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. For the invading German forces, this meant that their advance had to cover an enormous distance through unfamiliar territory. This vastness complicated logistics and command control. German supply lines had to stretch over hundreds of miles to provide fuel, ammunition, food, and medical support to frontline troops. As the Wehrmacht advanced deeper, these lines became increasingly vulnerable to attack and disruption by Soviet forces and partisan fighters. The long distances also delayed reinforcements and complicated communication across the multiple fronts. Diverse terrain, forests, steppes, swamps, and mountains. The Soviet Union's terrain was diverse, presenting a mix of forests, marshes, rivers, plains, and mountains that varied greatly by region. Northern sector. The area around the Baltic states and towards Leningrad was dominated by dense forests and numerous lakes. These natural obstacles slowed mechanized units and complicated movements of tanks and vehicles. Forests also provided cover for Soviet troops and partisan resistance groups, allowing them to mount guerrilla warfare against German supply lines. Central sector. The terrain around Moscow and the Central European plain consisted of a mix of farmland, small forests, and river valleys. While more open than the northern forests, the terrain still posed challenges in terms of river crossings and road infrastructure, which was often inadequate to support heavy mechanized movement. Another sector. The south featured the vast steppes of Ukraine and southern Russia, known for their flat, open plains. This terrain was better suited for armored warfare, allowing German panzer divisions to execute their blitzkrieg tactics more effectively. However, the southern sector also included the Crimean Peninsula, with its rugged terrain, and the Caucasus Mountains with steep slopes and harsh conditions that presented serious obstacles to the Wehrmacht. Swamps and marshlands, particularly near the Pripyat marshes in Belarus and Ukraine, hindered troop movement and mechanized units. These wetlands were almost impassable for tanks and trucks, forcing armies to take longer detours or risk becoming bogged down. Climate and seasonal challenges. The geographical scale of the Soviet Union also meant that the climate varied widely and had a profound impact on the operation. Spring and autumn mud seasons, Rasputitsa. One of the most notorious natural obstacles was the Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud caused by thawing snow in spring and autumn rains. This mud transformed dirt roads and fields into quagmires, immobilizing trucks, tanks, and artillery. The German military had hoped to avoid these seasons by launching the invasion in late June, but as the campaign dragged into autumn, the Rasputitsa severely slowed their advance and complicated supply and reinforcement efforts. Winter conditions. The German High Command had underestimated the brutal Russian winters. As Barbarossa extended into late 1941 and early 1942, freezing temperatures, snow, and ice became deadly enemies. The Wehrmacht was poorly prepared for winter warfare, lacking adequate clothing, vehicles, and winterized equipment. Soldiers suffered frostbite, machinery froze, and fuel supplies became unusable. Amadic sources, acclimatized and better equipped for the cold, gained an advantage, mounting effective counteroffensives. Infrastructure and transportation networks. The Soviet Union's underdeveloped infrastructure also played a major role in the campaign. Rails and rail work. Much of the Soviet road network consisted of dirt roads that quickly deteriorated in poor weather. Railways were the primary means of moving troops and supplies, but the Soviet rail gauge was different from the European standard used by Germany, requiring time-consuming track changes and logistical adjustments. The Germans had to repair or build new rail lines to support their advance, further straining resources. River systems. Numerous large rivers, such as the Dnieper, Don, and Volga, formed natural defensive barriers. German troops frequently faced delays and heavy losses trying to cross these wide rivers under enemy fire, German bridges destroyed by retreating Soviet forces. Control of river crossings was crucial and often fiercely contested. Vast forests and partisan warfare. The geography of the Soviet Union, particularly its dense forests, provided ideal terrain for Soviet partisan groups who waged a fierce guerrilla war behind German lines. These partisans sabotaged railways, ambushed supply convoys, and disrupted communication lines. The forests and swamps gave them natural cover and made it difficult for German anti-partisan units to root them out. The partisan warfare tied down significant German forces and drained resources that could otherwise be used at the front. The psychological impact of geography. The vast distances and harsh geography also had a profound psychological effect on German soldiers and commanders. As the Wehrmacht pushed further east, troops often felt isolated, exhausted, and disoriented in unfamiliar, hostile environments. The challenges of terrain and weather compounded the difficulties of fighting an enemy with enormous manpower reserves. The geographical features of the Soviet Union shaped Operation Barbarossa at every level. Vampoline vast forests and marshes enabled effective Soviet partisan resistance. Rivers served as natural defensive barriers against mechanized assaults. In combination, these geographical factors were decisive in slowing the German invasion and ultimately contributed to its failure. They turned what Hitler and his commanders hoped would be a quick campaign into a prolonged war of attrition that drained German resources and morale. What were some key battles that occurred during Operation Barbarossa? Battle of Bialystok-Minsk, June 22 to July 9, 1941. One of the earliest and largest encirclement battles of Barbarossa, the Battle of Bialystok-Minsk occurred shortly after the invasion began. The German Army Group Center launched a massive pincer movement aiming to trap large Soviet forces west of the Dnieper River. Using rapid mechanized advances, German panzer divisions encircled and destroyed significant elements of the Red Army. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured or killed in this battle. It was a crushing defeat for the Soviets, who had been caught unprepared. The victory opened the way for the German advance towards Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. However, the destruction of Soviet forces here did not lead to a collapse of Soviet resistance. The Red Army was able to retreat and regroup despite heavy losses. Battle of Smolensk, July 10–September 10, 1941. The Battle of Smolensk was a prolonged and bloody struggle to capture this strategic city on the road to Moscow. The Germans encircled and destroyed more Soviet troops, but met increasingly stiff resistance. Smolensk's defense delayed the German advance for several weeks. This gave the Soviets crucial time to reinforce Moscow's defenses and reorganize the Red Army. The battle revealed that despite early setbacks, Soviet forces were learning and adapting quickly. Though the Germans eventually captured Smolensk, the delay marked the beginning of a more attritional phase of the campaign that drained German momentum. Siege of Leningrad, September 1941, January 1944. The Siege of Leningrad was one of the longest and most horrific sieges in modern history. German and Finnish forces encircled the city, cutting off supplies and subjecting its population and defenders to starvation, bombardment, and freezing winters. Despite these brutal conditions, the city held out for nearly 900 days. Soviet forces repeatedly attempted to break the siege from the outside, and the resilience of Leningrad's citizens became a powerful symbol of Soviet resistance. The siege caused immense civilian suffering, with hundreds of thousands dying from hunger and shelling. It also tied down large German forces that could not be deployed elsewhere. Battle of Kiev, August 23, September 26, 1941. In the southern sector, the Battle of Kiev resulted in one of the largest encirclements of the war. German forces, mainly Army Group South, executed a massive pincer movement that trapped over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The capture of Kiev was a devastating blow to the Red Army's southern defenses and opened the way for further advances into Ukraine. The Germans captured massive amounts of equipment and prisoners, but the enormous resources used in the siege and battles left their forces stretched thin. Battle of Moscow, October 2, 1941, January 7, 1942. The Battle of Moscow was arguably the most crucial battle of Operation Barbarossa. The German offensive aimed to capture the Soviet capital before winter set in, believing that Moscow's fall would force the USSR's collapse. Initially, German forces made significant gains, but Soviet resistance stiffened. The arrival of fresh Soviet troops, many seasoned and well-equipped, bolstered the defense. The harsh Russian winter, along with logistical nightmares, stalled the German advance. In December 1941, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow. This marked the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht in the war and shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. Battle of Rostov, November 21st, December 2nd, 1941. The Battle of Rostov, fought in the Southern Theater, was one of the first significant Soviet counterattacks during Barbarossa. After German forces captured Rostov, a strategic city on the Don River, Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive. The Germans were forced to retreat from the city, marking the first time during Barbarossa that the Wehrmacht yielded territory. This battle highlighted the limits of German advances and the growing strength of the Soviet military response. The Siege of Sevastopol, October 1941, July 1942. Sevastopol, a heavily fortified port on the Crimean Peninsula, was a key Soviet naval base. The German and Romanian forces launched a prolonged siege against the city, using heavy artillery and air bombardment. The defenders fought fiercely, turning the siege into a costly and protracted battle. It lasted months longer than anticipated, tying down Axis forces and exhausting resources. Eventually, Sevastopol fell, but the prolonged siege weakened German capabilities on the southern front. These key battles illustrate the intensity and scale of Operation Barbarossa's fighting. Early rapid German encirclements like Bialystok, Minsk, and Kiev inflicted devastating losses but failed to end Soviet resistance. BRS prolonged sieges like Leningrad and Sevastopol drained German resources and tied down troops. The Battle of Moscow was a turning point, marking the first major German defeat. Soviet resilience, adaptability, and the harsh winter conditions increasingly blunted the German advance. Together, these battles set the stage for the brutal war of attrition that would define the Eastern Front for years to come. What role did weather conditions play in the outcome of Operation Barbarossa? Weather played a critical and often underestimated role in the progress and eventual failure of Operation Barbarossa. The German invasion, launched on June 22, 1941, aimed for a swift and decisive victory before the onset of autumn and winter. However, the varied and extreme weather conditions of the Soviet Union, ranging from spring mud to bitter winters, profoundly influenced the military campaign, logistics, troop morale, and ultimately the course of World War II on the Eastern Front. The early summer weather. Favorable but deceptive. When Operation Barbarossa began, the weather was initially favorable to the German forces. The late June sun and warm temperatures allowed the rapid advance of mechanized and motorized units. Dry roads and longer daylight hours enabled fast movement and extended combat operations. These conditions contributed to the success of the early blitzkrieg tactics, allowing German panzer divisions to encircle large numbers of Soviet troops quickly. During autumn 1941, as the German advance approached Moscow, heavy rains turned dirt roads and fields into thick mud that immobilized vehicles and tanks. The Wehrmacht's supply trucks, artillery, and armored units became bogged down, halting the rapid movement that had been their strategic advantage. The Rasputitsa severely disrupted supply lines, delayed reinforcements, and made it difficult to evacuate the wounded. German troops often had to continue fighting on foot while their vehicles were stuck or abandoned. The mud also made air support challenging, with aircraft unable to take off or land on muddy, makeshift airfields. This period was a logistical nightmare for the Germans and contributed to the loss of momentum before the critical Battle of Moscow. The harsh Russian winter. The winter of 1941-1942 was among the coldest in decades, and it struck the German forces unprepared. The Wehrmacht had been equipped and trained primarily for a swift summer campaign, lacking adequate winter clothing, shelter, and winterized vehicles. Soldiers suffered from frostbite and hypothermia, with many casualties caused not by combat, but by exposure. Weapons and vehicles malfunctioned as lubricants froze, batteries died, and engines seized. The Soviet Red Army, in contrast, was better acclimated and equipped for winter conditions. Soviet troops wore warm clothing, used skis and sleds for mobility, and were experienced in fighting in freezing weather. The German failure to prepare for winter severely impacted their combat effectiveness, troop morale, and ability to mount offensive operations. Beyond the physical challenges, weather conditions took a heavy psychological toll on German soldiers. Exhaustion, cold, hunger, and sickness weakened morale. Many troops felt abandoned by their leadership, who had failed to provide sufficient preparation or supplies for winter warfare. The harsh conditions contributed to discipline problems, desertions, and decreased combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, Soviet troops, fighting on home territory, were often motivated by survival, patriotism, and defense of their homeland, which strengthened their resilience. Weather conditions directly influenced the strategic outcomes of Operation Barbarossa. The Rasputitsa and winter halted the German advance just short of Moscow, preventing what Hitler hoped would be a swift and decisive capture of the Soviet capital. The delay allowed the Soviet Union to bring in fresh troops from Siberia, many of whom were experienced and acclimated to winter fighting. The subsequent Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941 pushed the Germans back and shattered the myth of their invincibility. The failure to anticipate and adapt to the weather was one of the key factors that turned Barbarossa from a lightning campaign into a prolonged war of attrition. How did Operation Barbarossa impact the civilian population in the Soviet Union? Operation Barbarossa was not only a colossal military campaign, but also a catastrophe for the civilian population of the Soviet Union. As the German Wehrmacht advanced rapidly into Soviet territory in 1941, millions of civilians found themselves caught in the crossfire of one of the most brutal theaters of World War II. The invasion unleashed profound human suffering, from widespread displacement and starvation to atrocities and destruction of homes and infrastructure. The impact on Soviet civilians was both immediate and enduring, deeply shaping the social and cultural fabric of the USSR for years to come. Operation Barbarossa was marked by some of the most horrific war crimes committed during World War II. Nazi ideology framed the invasion as a racial and ideological war against subhumans, Slavs, Jews, and communists, whom the Nazis sought to enslave, expel, or exterminate. The Wehrmacht and SS units carried out mass shootings, massacres, and reprisal killings against civilians suspected of supporting partisans or simply because of their ethnicity or political beliefs. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the German army and systematically murdered tens of thousands of Jews, Roma, and others. Entire villages were destroyed, and thousands of civilians were executed in what became part of the Holocaust by bullets. These atrocities instilled terror among the population, but also fueled fierce Soviet resistance. Destruction of infrastructure and homes. The fighting and scorched earth tactics used by both sides resulted in massive destruction of homes, farms, factories, and transportation infrastructure. Retreating Soviet forces often destroyed roads, bridges, and railways to slow the German advance, while the Germans bombarded cities and towns to break Soviet morale and defenses. Millions of people were left homeless, and rebuilding after the war would take years. The destruction disrupted everyday life and compounded the suffering of civilians who survived the fighting. Despite the horrors, many civilians resisted the occupation through partisan warfare. Forests and swamps became bases for guerrilla fighters who sabotaged German supply lines, attacked garrisons, and provided intelligence to the Red Army. What were the reasons for the failure of Operation Barbarossa? Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was Nazi Germany's bold attempt to crush the Soviet Union swiftly and decisively. Yet despite early spectacular successes, it ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. Instead of delivering a knockout blow, the campaign bogged down into a prolonged war of attrition that drained German resources and contributed heavily to the eventual defeat of the Third Reich. The failure of Barbarossa can be attributed to a complex mix of strategic miscalculations, logistical nightmares, Soviet resilience, harsh environmental factors, and ideological blindness. Understanding these reasons sheds light not only on the operation itself, but also on the broader dynamics of World War II's Eastern Front. Underestimation of Soviet strength and resolve. One of the most critical errors made by Adolf Hitler and the German High Command was the gross underestimation of the Soviet Union's military capabilities and the resolve of its people. Nazi propaganda and ideology painted the Soviet Union as a weak, backward state, ripe for quick conquest by the superior German military. The Germans expected the Red Army to collapse under the initial onslaught, much like Poland and France had done earlier in the war. However, the Soviet Union possessed enormous reserves of manpower and industrial capacity. The Red Army, though initially caught off guard and poorly led in some sectors due to Stalin's purges, was rapidly able to mobilize, reorganize, and learn from its mistakes. Soviet factories east of the Ural Mountains produced massive quantities of weapons and supplies beyond the reach of German bombers. Moreover, the Soviet people showed fierce determination to defend their homeland, inspired by patriotic fervor and fear of Nazi brutality. This underestimated resilience prolonged the war beyond German expectations. Hitler's grand strategic vision for Barbarossa was to crush the Soviet Union quickly by seizing Moscow, Leningrad, and the resource-rich regions of Ukraine simultaneously. This vast geographic scope meant the German army was divided into three main groups: Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, and Army Group South toward Ukraine, each with separate objectives. This dispersal diluted the German military's strength. Instead of concentrating forces for a focused, decisive strike, the Wehrmacht was stretched thin across a vast front. This allowed the Soviets to shift reinforcements between sectors and absorb German attacks piecemeal. Additionally, the complex terrain, long supply lines, and poor infrastructure further complicated coordination. This overextension was a fundamental flaw that made rapid conquest impossible. Operation Barbarossa took place across an immense expanse of territory, millions of square kilometers with inadequate roads and railways. The difference in railway gauges between Western Europe and the Soviet Union required time-consuming adjustments to rail lines. Poor road conditions, especially during the autumn Rasputitsa mud season, further hampered movement. Operation Barbarossa failed due to a combination of factors: underestimation of Soviet military strength and popular resolve, overambitious objectives and dispersion of German forces, severe logistical challenges over vast, poorly developed territory, harsh weather conditions that the Germans were ill prepared for, Stalin's initial mistakes but later military reforms, Nazi ideology provoking brutal occupation policies that fueled resistance, Soviet strategic depth and scorched earth tactics denying German resources, effective Soviet counterattacks that stalled and reversed German gains. This confluence of strategic, operational, environmental, and human factors turned what Hitler envisioned as a swift blitzkrieg into a protracted, grinding war that drained Nazi Germany's strength and paved the way for the eventual Allied victory. How did Operation Barbarossa change the course of World War II? Operation Barbarossa was arguably one of the most significant military campaigns in history. Its initiation on June 22, 1941, marked a dramatic escalation in World War II, transforming the conflict from a primarily Western European war into a brutal, massive struggle on the Eastern Front. The invasion fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war, reshaping alliances, military strategies, and the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century.
By invading the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany opened up the Eastern Front, the least and bloodiest theater of World War II. This front stretched thousands of miles from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea and became the primary battleground between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Before Barbarossa, the Soviet Union was bound by the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact with Germany and had remained relatively isolated from the Western Allies. The German invasion instantly made the Soviet Union a major Allied power, joining Britain, the United States, and others against the Axis. The initial German advances had seemed unstoppable, creating an aura of invincibility around the Wehrmacht. However, the failure to capture Moscow, the drawn-out siege of Leningrad, and the brutal Battle of Stalingrad shattered this myth. Operation Barbarossa revealed the limits of German military power and exposed vulnerabilities that the Allies would exploit. Barbarossa transformed World War II into a total war marked by ideological extremism and unprecedented brutality. The campaign was driven by Nazi racial ideology that framed the conflict as a war of annihilation against Judeo-Bolshevism. This led to mass atrocities, the Holocaust, and the genocidal treatment of civilians. The failure of Barbarossa forced a fundamental shift in German strategic priorities. Instead of a quick knockout, Germany found itself locked in a prolonged war of attrition against a vast and determined enemy. Regulars were increasingly diverted to the Eastern Front, weakening German efforts in other theaters. This overextension contributed to defeats in North Africa, Italy, and eventually Western Europe. The war prompted the Soviet Union to execute one of the largest industrial and military mobilizations in history. Factories and populations were relocated eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. The USSR produced staggering quantities of tanks, planes, artillery, and ammunition. Operation Barbarossa resulted in some of the highest casualties of World War II. Millions of soldiers and civilians died in the fighting, massacres, sieges, and genocidal policies. The immense suffering shaped Soviet and German collective memories and post-war politics. The war on the Eastern Front became central to Soviet identity and propaganda, emphasizing sacrifice and victory. The division of Europe after World War II was largely shaped by the outcomes of the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union's massive contributions to the defeat of Nazi Germany allowed it to assert influence over Eastern Europe. Operation Barbarossa was a turning point that reshaped World War II and the modern world. It opened the Eastern Front, transformed the Soviet Union into a key Allied power, and ended Nazi Germany's aura of invincibility.